Everybody, how are you? How's everybody tonight? Good? Are we good? All right, very good. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. It's Gloria Chou. Yes? All right. I'm going to mispronounce every time. She's the daughter of immigrant parents originally from China, and she was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, and she grew up in the American Catholic Church here in the States, and graduated from Indiana University in Bloomington. And after moving to the DC area, and this is why I'm so excited to have her, she's now a lay leader at Our Lady of China Pastoral Mission in Washington, DC, and in the DC area. I'm very excited to have her here to speak about that experience here, especially in the DC area, and what's going on to outreach to that community. So, welcome, Gloria. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much. So instead of starting with me, I thought we'd start with a funny video to catch your attention.
I saw it in you 100. Well, it is. It's painful and funny.
Technical difficulties here.
Is there any sound?
Yeah, it's quiet.
Put on subtitles, you got it. Oh, no. Dude, I can't read subtitles. I can't read subtitles.
You're right.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, well, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean. But I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
I'm Shastina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
No, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, actually. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Drop the bone to you. Let's give us more tea. Double, toil and trouble. Find the gift, beware Jack the Ripper. Bloody hell. Cheerio. I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
So I start with this because this is kind of my experience growing up. I was born in Louisville, Kentucky, right, where the Asian population is very, very low. But because I look different, these are the types of things I experience all the time. So today I'm here to talk to you about faith and culture and how they integrate, how they kind of diverge, and kind of the experience of being American but yet being Chinese at the same time. So I hope you'll ask any questions because I kind of feel like you in that I'm really Catholic and was brought up in the American church, but then I have this other side that's more on the Chinese side. So I'll kind of go into cultural things, Chinese church, what's going on, and I do first caveat everything I say by saying I am American-born Chinese, which means I've never lived in China. I do have some stereotypes of my own that I think of as Chinese, right? And things have changed over the years, and I'll tell you about the different ethnic groups and stuff that have affected that. Make sense? Okay, so with that, you'll see there are Chinese, actual Chinese words on the side. This is my name. And in the first thing when Father said, did I pronounce your name right? I had to cringe a little bit because nobody does. It's spelled C-H-O-U, so I say Chou or Chow when I introduce myself. but it's actually Zhou. And if I say that and then say C-H-O-U, people think I don't know how to spell. So I changed it, and most Chinese people tend to adopt an American name because they don't want to hear their name butchered because it does come out differently. But this is faith and culture, and you read actually up and down in the Chinese language, and so that's why the letters are that way. So first, growing up, I feel that I grew up in an American church, Our Lady of Lourdes in Louisville, Kentucky. There were no other Chinese people in that church other than I was, right? In all of Louisville, there's only one other family that was Chinese and Catholic. So my experience was growing up singing On Eagle's Wings and all those types of songs, right? And like everybody else, I went to grade school there and then went through high school, through 12 years of school. So I very much feel Catholic. And probably the same experience that you had, being born in the church, not ever having to convert or kind of have that experience, and also being shaped by the Judeo-Christian mindset of America, right? And that's very, very, very different than what you'll find out, it's more Chinese to think. But I've kind of grown up in this world, but I felt very American because you'll see all my classmates, all Caucasian. There was always a token Black person, token Filipino, token, every other race, but in general, it was kind of not diverse place to grow up, right? So things that you remember, kind of making your first communion together as a class, everything like that is the same about us. And so when I was there, actually, I never experienced prejudice from my classmates. I felt very much accepted, that I was just like them, we were studying the same thing. And it was interesting, they never actually asked me about my culture. They just kind of treated me like the rest. But underneath the surface, things were very different. Because outside of school, pretty much all my friends are Chinese. So there's a shared heritage and experience among people who live in America but are Chinese. And that's something called Chinese school, which most of us hate. It's an extra time of school where you have to go learn the Chinese language and Chinese music, culture, and arts. We also had potluck parties every Saturday, and it was with all the Chinese community. And you hang out together with all the generations. So your grandparents go, your parents go, and the kids go. And they all are in one big house. Everybody cooks something different, and we're all about the food. And then that's where you kind of have the thing where, while we thought we were normal, we would be singing karaoke a lot, right? That's a little Asian pastime. And doing other stuff that was, really culturally Chinese, right? We had very different experiences. And I remember going to my friend's house, and she had casserole, chicken casserole. And I was like, this is so good. And her mom's like, this is leftovers. I was like, but you can't order this at an American restaurant, because I had only gone to American restaurants where you could order steak or hamburgers. So I thought chicken divine or whatever she called it was awesome, right? Same thing when I went over to my friend's house for tea. A lot of my friends went to cotillion, and all these things were foreign to me because we just used chopsticks. So when you put extra knives and spoons, I'm like, why do they have all these? They're just at dinner at home, right? And it totally floors me. So I kind of knew I was different, but in my thought pattern, I watched the same shows that everybody else did at the time. I'll date myself. I was an 80s child. So I watched things like, Cosby Show, Family Ties, and that type of thing. Family Matters. I grew up with Saved by the Bell. So I thought very much of that type of idea, but my experience when I hang out with my friends, they all tend to be Chinese. Growing up Chinese, it's also interesting in the holidays, right? There are tons of Chinese holidays, so we got the best of both worlds. We had Christmas with a gift, and then Chinese New Year's you guys miss out on. You get red envelopes filled with money, and all you have to do is say, Happy Chinese New Year, and kind of bow to all your friends' parents, and they all give you money. So actually you can make out better than on Christmas, right? So everything that we did, we had a cultural thing, the August Moon Festival. The moon is the roundest. They go by the lunar calendar. I just know what we eat. Because we were Catholic, all the heritage of the weird stories all went out the window. With the Chinese August Moon Festival, there's something about some goddess being in the moon and a bunny being in the moon, and they got separated, some love lost or something. But we kind of avoided that part, just ate the food, right? But this did shape me, but I really felt I'm American. And actually my parents think of me as an American. They're like, oh yeah, you happen to speak Chinese, we happen to be that culture, but all your ideas are very American. So then it was really surprising when I joined Our Lady of China. So after school, I went to Indiana University in the middle, right? Indiana was interesting because it was all very Caucasian too, right? There were 3 Chinese groups on campus. You had to pick your allegiance. There was the one from Taiwan, the one from Hong Kong, and the one from mainland China. And so while my parents are from China, they went over to Taiwan before the war, so they never lived under a communist regime. So my parents told me to pick the one from Taiwan. Same thing happened at Louisville, but unbeknownst to us, we were like, why are our parents fighting? We just broke up into 2 Chinese schools when there are only a total of 100 families in all of Louisville. And it was based on, should we raise the Taiwan flag or the China flag? So then hop forward, and I'm now in DC, and then I go to this place called Our Lady of China Pastoral Mission. When I first got here, I actually refused to go. I went to St. John Newman, St. Mark's, everywhere around here, except Our Lady of China, because I'm like, no, I'm American church. But then slowly they didn't have enough teachers for religious education, and my mom volunteered me. And when I joined them, that's an Asian thing too, right? When I joined them, I actually found a lot in common with the kids. It was much smaller, but they all had to go to Chinese school just like I did, right? So you kind of had the same type of kids going to do this, but this is where my worlds clashed. I used to have a Catholic bubble, and they were all Caucasians in the Catholic bubble, right? The Chinese bubble, and they wouldn't mix. But when I went to Our Lady of China, they mixed. The first year I went to their family camp, I was quite disturbed because they line dance at Our Lady of China at their family camp. They karaoke, and they have Chinese mass. So they kind of squashed all my worlds into one and made me kind of scratch my head about like what's going on here, because it's very, very different, right? And the other thing you'll find, it's not as, I guess, similar as what I grew up with. It's actually a very big mix. We have a church in Rockville, Maryland, which is founded by people originally from Taiwan, so the people kind of like my parents who came over. Then we have the one in Chinatown, which was established by the Cantonese group. And now everybody coming is from China. So it's like an invasion on both sides. And they're culturally very different. The language like kind of bonds us, but they're very, very different in their thinking and everything. And we all collide and come together. So it's neat to see how faith and religion kind of come together overall. So that's kind of my background and where I come from, but you'll see my youth group that I help lead, and they're playing flag football. They play that every year. It's called their Turkey Bowl. And so they're very much like me, the American-born, who are like, no, this is our identity. Whereas you'll see the kids in Chinese school have to dress up in the pretty costumes like I did and do little dances and stuff, and you kind of have it all mixed together. Any questions about kind of experience and growing up before I move on to kind of Chinese culture and heritage? Okay, so I'll move on. So then this is Chinese culture and language. It is very different in that it's not a Judeo-Christian base, right? So a lot of the ideas come from different places. And again, that's why you have to differentiate where you're coming from. If you're coming from Taiwan and Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea even, a lot of them have a Confucian base of ideas, right? So if you think of that respect of elders thing, right? Like we always had to greet, like the first thing my mom would ask me, did you greet your elders or did you greet this auntie? I'm like, yes, Mom, I greeted her, right? The grandparents would go first in line when you went to eat something, right? And a lot of times, many generations will live in the same household. My grandparents actually grew up and lived with us, right? So that's a traditional Confucian idea. Similarly, education. Have you met any Tiger Moms kids? That is a Confucian idea, that education is very valuable and it's the way you get ahead. So a lot of the immigrant experience is that you had the tiger mom who said you had to get an A, you had to play an instrument or something, and you had to excel. And that also comes from that Confucian side of things. But then you have mainland China, and that is totally different because they grew up under an atheist rule, and they actually had a cultural revolution where they burned all the ancient Chinese stuff and tried to get rid of those ideas to instill the politically Maoist ideas in. So when you meet them, have you met people with gobs and gobs of money who are studying over here? And they don't seem to study very hard. And you're like, how come they're doing badly? Shouldn't they be the ones that ruin the curve on the grade, right? It's because they're coming from a very different place, right? And in the culture of China, it was really poor, and now all of a sudden it's really rich. And so they've had a dynamic shift, but they don't have underlying foundation of that value system. So it's often like, oh, I'm going to go home and inherit a conglomerate. So it doesn't matter if I do well or not. And they don't have the tiger moms. They're relaxed on that because they were raised by nannies. So it's a very different thing. And so when you think of Chinese people, they're not all the same. They're actually more than one race. Some people say there's 6 races, but I actually looked it up, and there are more than 55 races in China. And so while you think we all look the same, and I really can't tell Chinese people from Japanese people either, or Korean, so I think we look the same. But that's why you have Yao Ming, the basketball player, who's really, really tall. And then the rest of them and us seem short because there are different races. There are also different languages. While we call them dialects, like Cantonese and Mandarin, they actually estimate there are over 13 cultural dialect pods that are different. So I learned one Cantonese thing I can tell you. It took me a long time to remember this. And you say, "Say gong Guangdonghua" is how you say I don't understand Cantonese in Cantonese. But if you say it in Mandarin, it's 我不懂广东话. So it's a very, very different tonal thing. And so you'll often find if you go to China, you know, there's a common language that's Mandarin-based, that's from the Beijing dialect, and everybody's supposed to speak that. But actually, I think it's funny, my accent is probably better than 50% of the people in China, because they have a dialect where I only have American accent in my Chinese, right? But there's a lot of differences, and that also shapes them and shapes like where the Chinese culturally Catholic people are and where they're not, and where that was spread. So with the Chinese language, I also want to explain, like, when you see Chinese people, why there might be differences, or you may think they seem kind of uneducated because their grammar is awful, because it's a very different language base, right? So my dad, he still mixes today all his he's and she's, because in Chinese there's only one word for he and she, and it's ta. So when he tells a story, he'll start off and say, Jeff so-and-so did blah, 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 and then he'll say, she did this, and I'm like, I thought this was about Jeff. And I'll have lost the thread in the middle of his story. But it's because when it's spoken language, it's the same word. Also, there's no past tense, past participle, future tense, and all this stuff we deal with. It's actually, you just use a helper verb, right? You say, 我去吃饭, I'm going to eat. 我昨天去吃饭, I went to eat yesterday. 我明天要去吃饭, I'm going to eat tomorrow. But it's all based on changing and saying when you did it. It's not changing the verb. So often when you hear people who seem to mix that, it's because of that also. Also, Chinese is a very strange language. So you see the Chinese words up in the top corner? So it's actually a pictogram. Every block is a word and has a sound and has a meaning. And you just have to memorize that it looks like that. And that's why I am practically illiterate in Chinese. They tell you it's so easy when you're little. They're like, look, the sun has a dot in the middle and around, just like if you drew rays. And it works for the word sun, it works for some words, and then it breaks down from there. So ideograms and stuff, you're like, what is this? And then in the past, before Google Translate, you had to look up the word by counting the number of strokes, looking down a list in the dictionary, finding it, and it'll have more Chinese words to tell you what it means. So it wasn't very successful for me, at least, right? So it is a very different language, and that's also what gets into spelling issues, because they don't spell, they memorize. And it's also culturally interesting because my one professor was an anthropology teacher, and she taught Chinese, but she studied anthropology. And she's like, the reason some Chinese people will do better in math is because Chinese language is a right brain language, not a left brain like English is. And that's the same side that does higher math like calculus. And so since they're working that side of the brain all the time, higher math tends to be easier for the Chinese culture, or the people who really know Chinese. Finally, it's interesting, my professor in a college actually told me that I have a very sing-songy voice. And he said to practice speaking in monotone, because I sound too young. But it was interesting. It was a note that the Chinese language has tones, and it's all based on tones on what you say. So Chinese has 4 tones, and Cantonese has 6 tones, and other dialects have more. So if you can hear the difference, there's ma, 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 ma. Did you hear the difference? And then if you hear say ma, 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 I just said a sentence. I said, did the mother yell at the horse? So depending on your accent, you could be insulting somebody badly or saying the right word. My brother-in-law, who's Caucasian, he was like so excited to learn Chinese. And one time we were out at dinner, and he's like, "Ganbei," and everybody just stared at him. We're like, "You said scallop." He's like, "I meant to say ganbei," which is cheers, bottoms up, cheers, right? So again, like you'll have lots of funny stories where people say something wrong and mean something totally different. So the Chinese language has a lot of intonations, and you have to be able to hear the difference to really know what you're saying, right? So the Chinese culture and language is a lot of fun. You'll see the costumes, because there were so many emperors and empresses and all these different things. You have indigenous little kids who are sometimes Chinese Indian, and that type of thing. And so there's a lot of richness in the history that has come through. And again, that's what we honor. And you'll see I went to a movie studio. I used to watch all those things with my grandfather and grandmother, you know, all the martial arts ones where they can fly in the air and stuff. I thought it was pretty cool. But that's kind of culture. But again, you have to know which side you're talking to. So if you meet somebody who's Chinese, right? If you know they're from mainland China versus Taiwan versus Hong Kong, they'll have a very different experience of the Chinese history because of where they come from, right? But the language part stays the same pretty much, and that's what kind of bonds us together. So Chinese Catholics, I thought, you know, since we're in a Catholic group, this would be kind of interesting. And I have some statistics and stuff on the other thing, but it hasn't actually been in China for that long, right? The first Franciscans, I have the dates, were like 600 was the first time they went into China, right? The gospel went there. It wasn't very early. The guy on the left, can you tell he's Italian? That's Matteo Ricci. He is a Jesuit priest, and he was actually the one in the 1500s who went to China and shared Western ideas like astronomy and everything with the Chinese emperor. And he actually won a lot of respect from the whole court. The imperial court actually honored him, and he's still buried in China, the only kind of Westerner grave that wasn't totally destroyed. But that's how he kind of translated the religion to them and was able to win respect for them. But you'll see these kind of ornate things that kind of look like a temple. That's a Catholic church. But it's just kind of decorated in Chinese form. And you end up having Catholics all over Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, everywhere. But they all kind of took on their own form in their own time. But there are actually really few. I think it's estimated at 0.34% of the population of China. So, here are my numbers, because I won't remember. So Christianity is 2.5% of the overall population, and Catholics are 0.34% of the overall population. But the issue that, I guess, really, this is why the Pope and anybody cares, because there are so many people in China that that 0.34 is 5.7 million Catholics in the CCPA. So that's another thing I actually didn't know for a long time. there's a Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, which is the association that the communist government approves. So if you're in that church, you're in the communist government-approved Catholic church that is run by the communist government, or sanctioned by them. There's an underground church of maybe, and with them it's maybe 10 to 30 million. Because what happened is when the Chinese communists cracked down on the religion, they went underground and just had house churches. And the bishops continued to pass down the line. So you have the two churches, and in China it's a total mess because depending on where you are, which city, which province, whether the local government is very strict or not, sometimes the churches know of each other, sometimes one is hiding, sometimes they put people in prison and stuff, and so it's all over the place. But there's no way to get a good count because the only way to count you really is to ask the Communist Party, and they're trying to squash it, so it's a little bit fragmented. But you'll see from the map that the Catholics are the black little crosses. So when you find Catholics, you'll find them from certain regions where the missionaries had great success, where they were able to keep it. There's actually one mountain where Our Lady, they think, appeared in that they chased away the communists, right? And they say Michael appeared with her and actually succeeded for them. And that area, everybody in that village is Catholic, right? There's no shaking them from it. Whereas other places it's very fragmented. But you'll see in all of China, there are very few of these little black crosses, right? And it does tend to be a very great missionary area because they have been atheists for so long. There's an emptiness. And so actually there are tons of conversions in Shanghai to the underground church. They're not being afraid of being persecuted. They're not afraid of being put in prison for their faith because they are finding love and reality of truth that they don't have and that has been covered up and hidden from them. So some people like to say Asia is the third wave of conversions, right? Because it's still the most untouched by the Christian religion overall, and therefore a very fertile ground for conversions. And this is why Pope Francis is trying to figure out how to establish relationships again, even though it would still be communist controlled. He still wants to establish it because there's so many people who haven't heard the gospel in China. I was asking my dad, who's Catholic, and my mom, who was Catholic, thank goodness, because then I got to be Catholic. But he was saying, like, growing up, you wouldn't hear about Christianity. You didn't hear about Jesus. It wasn't really prevalent. He was invited by one of his friends to a Lutheran youth group, and the guy who only wanted to go to meet girls. And I don't think he's Christian anymore, but he kind of brought my dad. But otherwise, there wasn't a really understanding of Jesus, and it really wasn't well known. You could go your whole life and really not hear the gospel there. And, they do have a sense of God, right? A lot of their words in ancient Chinese, they actually seem to replicate. This is fascinating. I don't know if you want to believe it or not, because Christians say it, and so it might be colored. But a lot of the words for God and the words for creation and garden and killing people and stuff is very similar to Bible stories until the Tower of Babel, right? The Tower of Babel scattered everybody. But before then, if we were united in the language, the stories of Cain and Abel, the Garden of Eden, can kind of be seen in some of the words. So it's really interesting. And they also have a sense of Tian, which is the sky, and that's where God is, right? And so they've always had that. But since then, Buddhism has come in, Hinduism has come in, Taoism is more originated kind of there with the yin and the yang and all that fun. And so it's all kind of mixed together. So you'll often find Chinese people, even from Taiwan and stuff, and they'll go to some temple, pick a fortune, light an incense in front of a picture, and they don't really know what they're doing. And it's actually a mix. They're the least purest of all the cultures in their religion. Hinduism takes a different form in China. It's not pure. It's mixed with some of the other religions. So they were probably the least ones where things aren't very clear, right? But they do tend to have that sense, but in the communist government it's very different because since childhood you're a part of the Communist Party, right? It's like being a brownie or a Boy Scout here. They kind of indoctrinate you with ideas, and one of them is that it's stupid to believe that God exists. So this is kind of the curriculum they're under. So again, depending on where they're from, some Chinese have a sense that there has to be some sort of God, right? And they're Buddhist or something and trying their best to live a good life. And then other ones from communist China were encouraged to not think there is, right? But they are longing from it because they still have that emptiness that St. Augustine talks about. My heart is restless till it rests in thee. It's still an empty hole. And so that's why the conversions are happening in China, because they have that emptiness. This is a timeline of the Catholic Church. Again, I was born in America, so I didn't know all this, but I looked it up for you. In 600 is when the Franciscans went in, but again, it went up and down, and until Matteo Ricci in 1582, Catholicism wasn't really in there. And so he was the first one who was really recognized as spreading it widely enough, right? By 1949, right before 1949, after the World War II, they estimate there were like, I want to say, maybe 4 million Catholics at that point, right? But then you had all these other things happen, like, you know, the Boxer Rebellion was a long time ago, but Chairman Mao, when he came in, that's really what changed things, right? Because after he declared the government communist, after that, they started asking you, they kicked out all the missionaries from Western countries, the nuns, or they locked you in prison or sent you to the equivalent of a Siberian work camp. I don't know where it is in China, like what part of it, but they put you into labor camps, right? And actually, some of my friends' parents, were telling me that they used to have the Catholic Church right next to their house, and so they'd go every day for Mass. After the communists took over, they tried to do the house Mass, but then they invited you over and they questioned you about what you believed. And so they kind of had to denounce their faith to kind of stay out of this 1955 persecution, right? So they didn't feel good about it, but that's what they did to kind of sustain it. So what's interesting is also in 1955, the loyalty had to be to the communists, not to the Pope. And so it's very like Anglicanism, right? Like if you take your fealty to King Henry VIII and you're St. Thomas More and get killed, because now that's a different religion, right? So that happened, but it didn't open up again. And so at that time, Pope Pius condemned it. And then it didn't get opened up again until 81, where you are now able to say the Pope is the head of the church, but, you know, spiritually. But the physical head of the church is still the Catholic Chinese Patriotic Association, right? And so you have a lot of martyrs, over 120 martyrs that they recognized under John Paul II. And you have people like Bishop Kong, who was locked up for 30 years. And actually, John Paul II made him a cardinal, right? Because he was locked up for his faith. And you still have it going on, which is really scary. They actually, like a few months ago, had something where they declared if you're under 18, it's illegal to go into a Catholic church now. So it's, you know, new sanctions coming down. They've knocked down churches. They kind of go back and forth. And again, it depends on your area and your region. But it's still very much the control issue, right? Because if you saw Poland and how it totally disintegrated after Pope John Paul II went in, right? And the Liberation Party kind of took over, they don't want the same thing to happen. So they're afraid of true religion. Actually, I've been told by many people that even Buddhism in China is fake. They have monks in the Shaolin temple so that they can advertise to you and talk to you about martial arts, but they're not really Buddhist. But their people are figureheads who are put in to win the hearts of Southeast Asia. So you have a lot of convoluted things going on there. Again, from my outsider's view, I can't understand everything, but it is a very different culture. And I will say, I think everybody's good-hearted, like at some level, but because of the way some of them were raised, it does really shape their outlook on life, and it's very different from what we see. So that's all in my slides. The other thing I want to just open it up to is to see if you've had any experiences or you ever have any questions when you're encountering somebody who's Christian or who's Catholic or doesn't believe, or Chinese or any other ethnic group that you've never really wanted to ask? Because I'm kind of like, I feel on both sides. I think I can answer them honestly and just kind of tell you what it's like to be in another race or another culture growing up here in America. So.
I'm curious. I'm curious to know about Our Lady of China. What can you tell us about Our Lady of China, and maybe how that apparition might be able to help evangelize Chinese people who are here?
Got it. So Our Lady of China, she's actually appeared on that mountain and I think it's called Sisam Mountain. And when it was, I think it was during the Boxer Rebellion, actually, in the 1800s, when they were coming to actually take down the church and everything, the people were praying to Our Lady, and they didn't actually see her, but they saw a bright light, and they were all turned back. All the troops were turned back from that apparition, and after that they built a statue of her on top of that. So when she's pictured, actually the artists have depicted her as an empress, and Jesus as a little emperor in the little yellow clothes. It's really cute. And then actually in Our Lady of China there is a mosaic in the Basilica of the National Shrine where she's pictured as more of a goddess in traditional garb there that was done for the Chinese people. It is very much what you're talking about how you reach out to them. It is very interesting in that Chinese people think of Christianity as a Western religion. So they think of it as not theirs, right? Like, oh, that's the invader religion, or that's another thing coming in, and it's not our religion, right? And so a lot of times the appeal to Our Lady of China, or the appeal to, like, before the Tower of Babel, you guys knew the true God, right? Some of your emperors seem to know, that, and, promote that before, tends to be kind of a new draw in to say, it's not this outsider thing, the love is for you too, and he's just as much your God as our God, right? Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
I was wondering, so I live on campus, and I have a lot of, Chinese students on our floor, and like you said, a lot of them are, not really, brainwashed, but, have that upbringing. How would you, tackle that, to talk to them, since, this language barrier is one, but, two, how would you want to, how would you tackle talking to, your more mates about Catholicism?
Well, how to talk and outreach. I think the first outreach to them, because they've been kind of given this knowledge that, oh yeah, it's all not real, it's not, kind of fake, is to first accept them and kind of just treat them like friends, right? I think one thing too is when you're treated different, you start to bristle up and act different. Oh yeah, I can speak Chinese and speak with my Chinese friends here and just not deal with you guys, right? It's like us versus them. So first thing is, you want to become their friend and, say we have more similarities than differences, right? Let's say we both like to go shopping or we both like to do whatever, and build that foundation first. And then what's really interesting is, although they don't like to discuss ideas of religion, they're actually more open than I find Americans are to the idea of exploring religion, in that they think it's very foreign and very different. So they've never experienced it. So it's kind of like Americans are been there, done that, I don't want any part of it, right? They've already condemned it and said no. They've not heard it. So if you invite them to Mass or something where they can go see the Basilica, or even I invited my martial arts coach to a church picnic bazaar, because he had never been to one. It's very American. So he was fascinated by it. And again, it wasn't abrupt. He didn't have to accept the religion yet, but he kind of gradually understood that being Catholic was a part of what I did. And he was excited to see the different culture and how it shapes your culture. So I would encourage you to start there instead of start about a dialogue about abortion or about God and the true, don't start with those discussions, because they've been kind of told not to believe that. Start with just the welcoming, and then gradually invite them to things. What was fascinating to me also is one time my friends were talking about what'd you do this weekend? I was like, oh, I just got back from a youth group retreat, had all these kids. And she's like, why didn't you invite my kids? I was like, I didn't know you're Catholic. She's like, we're not. Are you Christian? No. She's like, but it's good for them like, to be exposed, right? And we've actually had a lot of conversions at Our Lady of China Pastoral Mission because we run a Chinese school. So the parents all come here and they still want their kids to speak Chinese. And what our parents would tell them is, did you know Judeo-Christianity is the foundation of America? So your kids should know something about this religion. So don't you want them to go to religious ed classes after Chinese school? And they like, academics, so they sign them up. And we've actually had 2 or 3 conversions where their parents were not Christian, but the kids became Christian because of going to CCD classes, right? So they're still a little bit open to it, just probably not dialoguing about the issues, but being invited, they're very open to. Yes?
Going back to language, since your academia was in English, was there any dissonance between you and your parents to try to explain abstract thoughts to them?
There's always a little bit of a gap. My dad, whenever he thinks he's speaking about something difficult, he switches into English, which is probably worse because his English is really not good. So there's always been a little bit of a gap in that. He can't go as deep as he wants to because of the language barrier. So that's always been, I think, a traditional issue is how good is the Chinese, spoken Chinese, written Chinese of the next generation. So for example, a lot of my friends, some of them didn't go to Chinese school or didn't learn Chinese when they were little because they found one friend, her older siblings, they learned Chinese growing up. They went to kindergarten and couldn't understand and get along. So then when she came along, she's 3rd child, they taught her no Chinese. And so that she could fit in. But now her Chinese accent is horrible and she can't fix it anymore. So there's always this gap because the language barrier is actually why Our Lady of China Pastoral Mission exists still. Actually, the Filipinos aren't allowed their own church because their English is too good. But in Chinese, right, my parents grew up going to Louisville, Kentucky, American Mass. And the reality is they didn't really understand the gospel and the Old Testament and everything as well. And it was in Latin before, so they had trouble understanding all the concepts. And so sometimes I'm still surprised. I'm like, Dad, that's not a Catholic idea. And it's because he didn't have it explained in his language. So now that we do go to Our Lady of China and they have Bible studies in Mandarin, he's able to go much deeper in his thought of even understanding theology. And it's the same with me. Now that I go to Mandarin Mass with him, oh no. But Old Testament totally floors me. No clue what they're saying half the time unless I recognize a story. Psalms are kind of lost on me too. I like gospel. I know this story. Yay! Or so there are a lot more technical words that were never able to be expressed in the generations. And you are finding by the 3rd generation. So I count as 2nd generation because my parents came in. My nephews and my nieces and stuff, they end up really not speaking almost at all. My nephews, they can speak and say, I want candy in Chinese, but that's about all. Because again, once you're 2nd generation, you really feel American. And so the question is, why should I need to teach Chinese to my children when I'm fully American and established here? A lot of the kids who grew up in Our Lady of China don't come back to Our Lady of China after they graduate from college. They go to their American local church. Should it be that way? I don't know, but most of them go back to the American church because they feel more connected to that than they do the Chinese heritage. So the heritage usually only lasts 1 to 2 generations, in my opinion, right? Because you want to fit in, ultimately. Any other questions? Anything else?
So, what are some of the traditions that have come from traditional Chinese culture that would identify a Chinese Catholic Mass as somehow unique, other than the architecture of the church, and obviously it being in Mandarin?
I actually don't know that there's anything unique about it because we're the universal church. Other than the language, it doesn't really change. Although you will still have practices, like every year for our Chinese New Year, we'll have a celebration where they try to incorporate, just like St. Patrick did, part of the ancient traditions. And so they'll have kind of like okay, it's not ancestor worship. Have anybody watched the Disney Mulan thing? Yeah, okay, so they have the picture of your ancestor, and they put like incense, little candles to them, right? And then they burn money, because they think they can use it in heaven or the equivalent of heaven. So some of this, I don't know if it's Buddhist, Taoist, whatever, but it's a form of honoring and praying for the dead that Catholics have spun, just like they spun the Druid Halloween thing. So they're trying to spin some things that traditional Chinese people would still honor, be like, oh no, but that's my grandparents, or that's my mom. I still have to respect them and be praying for them and offering things for them. So they've kept parts of things like that. Although Mass is really not different other than the language from what I've seen.
Are there any modern day Chinese saints or any Chinese saints that you
I actually only know one of the 120 martyrs. One was called Augustine Zhao, but I don't know his story. But one fascinating story, I don't know if she's ever named, but it is one little girl in China when they were doing the persecutions and everything. They took a priest, they placed him under arrest, and they destroyed the church, and she saw them destroy it. And one of the things that happened is when they were doing that, the tabernacle, they desecrated that, and all the hosts fell on the floor that were consecrated. So there's a story of how she, every night, because back then they told you could only have Eucharist one time a day, so every night she actually crawled back to that location and just put her tongue to them to lick them off the floor, because you weren't allowed to touch them back then either. And so she went there every night until they were all consumed, and she actually died on the last night. They found her and killed her. So I kind of think that's very special, because you can see how deep it went for her.